She wasn't used to airports, and airports weren't used to women like her. That was obvious from the moment she stepped into Terminal 7 with a faded canvas bag and shoes that had weathered more winters than most passengers had faced layovers. Her name was Eileen. 71. Wrinkles in the right places. Hands that remembered every dish she ever washed, every coat she ever stitched. She had ironed shirts for 27 years, raised 3 children, buried 1 husband, and quietly restarted her life in a house with more garden than furniture. She didn't travel often, but this was special. She was flying to San Diego for her sister's birthday. They hadn't seen each other in over a decade. She had saved up for months, sewing mending jobs for neighbors, clipping coupons, and skipping coffee shop treats to buy a one-way ticket in economy. She wore her Sunday coat, not because it was stylish, but because it was clean. The shoes, though, betrayed her. Old leather, split at the seam, polished but tired. She noticed the glances. First, from the woman in line behind her, thin, dressed in smooth fabrics, with sunglasses indoors and a boarding pass for first class. Then from the 2 young flight attendants whispering at the gate desk, pretending to talk about policies while side-eyeing Eileen's socks. But she kept smiling. Quiet. Gentle. She clutched her boarding pass with both hands, like a ticket to another world. When her group was called, she stepped forward with a slow dignity. 1 step. Another. Until the voice came. "Excuse me, ma'am, this is boarding for Group 4, economy seating." Eileen blinked. "Yes, I'm Group 4. The gate agent forced a polite smile. "Are you sure, ma'am? Can I see your boarding pass again?" Eileen handed it over. She didn't mind. People made mistakes. But the agent didn't even look at the seat number before glancing down at Eileen's shoes and whispering something to the attendant beside her. "Go ahead," the agent said at last, handing it back with a tone that suggested charity more than confirmation. "Gate's down that way." Eileen walked on, trying not to feel small. But as she turned down the jet bridge, she heard a laugh behind her. The young woman from earlier, sunglasses now pushed up into perfect hair, leaned toward her friend. "She probably got that ticket from some church raffle," she said with a smirk. "Those shoes? My dog has better." Her friend chuckled. "Someone's grandma trying to relive the 60s. She's probably never flown before." Eileen's ears turned warm, not from anger, but from the strange, disorienting sting of being unseen. Unnamed. Assumed. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. But did kindness expire with age? Did dignity wear out like Saul's? Inside the plane, she found her seat by the window. Row 28. She sat slowly, placing her bag beneath the chair ahead, folding her coat on her lap. The flight was nearly full. Voices filled the aisle. Bags thudded into overhead bins. Screens flashed safety videos. She stared out the window, watching luggage trucks move like beetles beneath the belly of the plane. Then came the woman with the sunglasses, boarding late with privilege and perfume. She paused at the row. "Oh no," she said dramatically. "Is this my row?" She looked at the man next to Eileen and pointed to the middle seat. "I'm there, between her and the restroom." She said her the way someone might say it. Eileen smiled softly. "You're welcome to the window if you'd prefer." "No thanks," the woman replied curtly. "I didn't pay for a middle seat to be talked to." The words dropped like stones. The man in the aisle seat shifted uncomfortably. Eileen didn't respond. She had survived far worse than words. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered the smell of her sister's garden. She would see her soon. That was enough. The flight attendants walked by, offering snacks, safety cards, and robotic pleasantries. None of them spoke to Eileen, but one of them lingered to chat with the woman beside her. "I saw what happened at the gate," the attendant giggled. "Honestly, she looks like she wandered in from a bus station." "I know, right?" the woman whispered, biting into a protein bar. "I just hope she doesn't stink up the flight. I have a lunch meeting right after landing." Eileen kept her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. One line of thread in the headrest had come loose, dangling slightly. She focused on that. Not the voices, not the weight in her chest, until something changed. A voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for the brief delay. Our captain had to address an urgent call before takeoff, but will be joining us momentarily." The cabin settled. Seatbelts clicked. Phones powered down. And then, footsteps. Not from the cockpit. From the entrance. A man entered. Not young, but steady. Silver at the temples. Blue uniform. Pilot stripes. Command in every step. "Captain Harrison, one flight attendant whispered. But Eileen didn't whisper. She sat upright, hands frozen, eyes wide, because the man in uniform was her husband. Eileen didn't move. Her breath caught somewhere between surprise and something deeper, a quiet, proud kind of recognition only long years of love could summon. The man in uniform stepped into the cabin with calm authority, scanning the rows like a general before battle. His eyes, steady and kind beneath the shadow of his captain's hat, paused only when they found her. There was no public announcement, no dramatic gesture, just the barest lift of his brow and a flicker of something warm in his gaze that no one else noticed. But she did. The woman beside her shifted, adjusting her silk scarf, her perfume suddenly sharp in the recycled cabin air. She hadn't recognized him. Not yet. To her, he was just another pilot. But not to Eileen. The captain made his way toward the cockpit, nodding politely at a flight attendant who stepped aside with a deferential smile. "Good to have you back on board, sir," she said. "Thanks, Angela," he replied, voice smooth, practiced, yet carrying the undertone of someone used to commanding rooms and aircraft alike. As he reached the front, he paused, then turned, addressing the entire cabin, not from the intercom, but in person, as though this flight, this moment, required something more human than protocol. "Before we prepare for takeoff," he began, "I want to thank everyone for their patience. I'm Captain Henry Lane. I'll be flying you to San Diego today. But before we close the doors, there's one special passenger I'd like to acknowledge." His eyes moved slowly through the cabin, then landed again, squarely, on seat 28A. "That woman right there," he said, pointing with no hesitation, "is my wife, Eileen. She doesn't fly often. Not anymore. But today she made the effort to come see her sister. I just wanted everyone to know that before I trusted my hands with this aircraft, I trusted hers to hold me together for the last 40 years. Silence fell across the rows. Not the stunned kind, not immediately. It was the silence of mental gears grinding, of people recalculating everything they thought they knew. The woman next to Eileen went stiff. The man across the aisle blinked, and someone in first class craned their neck to get a better look. Eileen's cheeks flushed, but she didn't shrink. She didn't wave or smile for approval. She simply nodded once, gently, as if to say, "I see you too." Captain Lane offered her the faintest smile, the kind only two people with decades of quiet understanding can share, then disappeared into the cockpit. But the silence he left behind was louder than his words. Now they looked. All of them. The designer woman with the sunglasses, the flight attendants who had whispered, the businessman with the expensive watch. Now they saw her. But it wasn't awe on their faces. It was shame. Because it wasn't just that Eileen was married to the man who literally owned the skies they were flying through. It was that their judgment had missed something infinitely more valuable than status. They had missed character. She hadn't needed to prove anything, hadn't corrected their mockery, hadn't defended herself. She had let the moment pass, choosing grace over confrontation. And now, grace had answered for her. The woman beside her cleared her throat. I didn't realize," she muttered, voice suddenly small. Eileen turned, her face soft, not smug. "That's all right," she said kindly. "Most people don't at first." The words hung there, not as a rebuke, but as a truth, gently delivered. The flight attendants passed again, this time their tones different, warmer. One of them even knelt beside her. "Would you like anything, Mrs. Lane? A drink? Pillow?" Eileen smiled. "Just water, thank you." She wasn't interested in suddenly being treated like royalty. That had never been the point. She sipped her water quietly as the plane began to taxi, watching the world outside blur into motion. As the engines roared and the cabin tilted skyward, something shifted inside that space. Not just altitude, but atmosphere. People who had once dismissed her now avoided her eyes. The couple who had mocked her at the gate pretended to sleep. A teenage girl across the aisle stared at Eileen's shoes, not with disdain, but with wonder. Perhaps for the first time, she realized that dignity doesn't shine. Sometimes it's worn into the seams of old leather. Somewhere over Nevada, the captain came over the speaker again. His voice, even from behind the cockpit door, carried a smile. "Cruising at 34,000 feet, smooth skies ahead. Might even get you in early. I hear someone has a birthday to catch." Eileen smiled to herself, tucking her coat closer. Below them, the world rolled on. Mountains, rivers, towns where no one knew who she was or what just happened. But above all that, suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, she rested. Not because she had been vindicated, but because she hadn't needed to be. She had always known who she was. And now, so did they. Long after the seatbelt sign dimmed and the hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm, Eileen rested her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The sky outside was endless, soft with pale clouds that stretched like stories yet to be told. She wasn't thinking about the stunned expressions or the whispers that had fallen silent. She wasn't even thinking about Henry's words, though they still echoed in her chest. Her thoughts had drifted elsewhere, to the beginning, to the life that brought her here, to all the invisible moments that had quietly built the woman everyone thought they could overlook. She met Henry Lane 46 years ago, in a bookstore neither of them could afford to shop in. She was working 2 jobs, one at the bakery and one as a part-time receptionist at a dentist's office. He had just come back from military service and was training to be a flight instructor. He walked in looking for a second-hand copy of The Little Prince. Something about flying and loneliness and the desert had always stuck with him. She was standing near the classics section, dusting covers, stealing poetry between shifts. He noticed her reading Neruda without a bookmark and asked her which poem she'd give a man trying to understand forgiveness. She laughed and told him that no poem could teach that, but maybe she'd lend him the book anyway. He brought it back a week later. No note, but a fresh daffodil between the pages. That was Henry. Not loud, not flashy, just precise, present, intentional, like the way he flew, like the way he loved. They married the next spring, not in a church, but in her sister's backyard, with 20 people and a lemon cake that melted in the sun. She wore a dress she sewed herself, and he wore a tie that didn't match his shoes. They danced to a cassette player on the porch, and when it broke halfway through the second song, they kept dancing anyway. Life wasn't grand after that. There were bills, late nights, dented cars. Their first child came early. Their second didn't come at all. There were hospital visits and arguments about money, and nights when Henry didn't come home until long after midnight, because another plane had needed him more than she had. But through it all, there was something neither of them said out loud, an understanding that they were building something bigger than themselves. Not in bank accounts, but in how they endured, in how they chose each other again and again, through fatigue, through fear, through the slow weathering of years. As Henry rose through the ranks, from co-pilot to captain to executive, Eileen never asked for recognition. She hated board dinners, detested press events. She found her purpose in smaller things, tutoring kids in the neighborhood, planting herbs by the window, writing letters by hand. And yet, behind every milestone he reached, there was her name, softly unspoken, holding steady like a lighthouse behind storm glass. When Henry was offered the chance to buy a minority stake in a fledgling regional airline, it was Eileen who believed in it more than he did. "You were born to fly," she told him. "But make sure you bring something good back down to earth." Now here she was, flying in that very airline, on a ticket bought with decades of quiet sacrifice, seated next to a woman who judged her by her shoes. Eileen looked down at those shoes now, the stitching worn, the leather faded where it bent with each step. She had considered buying a new pair for the flight, but these were the ones she had walked into their first apartment with, the ones she had stood in at her son's wedding, the ones she wore the day she scattered her father's ashes by the lake. They were part of her, not decoration, not disguise. The flight attendant returned, softer this time. "Mrs. Lane," she said. "The captain asked if you'd like to join him in the cockpit after the landing. He says it's been a while since you've watched him land one." Eileen chuckled. "Has it really been that long?" "Yes, ma'am. Almost 12 years, he said. She nodded. "Well then, I suppose I should." The woman beside her shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. She had said nothing since the captain's announcement, and now the silence hung between them like fog. Finally, she leaned slightly toward Eileen, her voice low. "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you, and that wasn't fair." Eileen met her eyes, not coldly, not kindly, just honestly. "We all misjudge sometimes," she said. "It's what we do after that matters." The woman looked down at her manicured hands, nodding. "For what it's worth, you carry yourself better than I ever could in those shoes." Eileen smiled. "These old things, they're just shoes. But thank you." Outside the window, the sky began to shift as the plane dipped ever so slightly, beginning its descent into San Diego. The coastline glittered in the distance, blurred by sunlight and memory. Eileen folded her hands again, resting them gently over her lap, over years of living that could not be seen at a glance. There would be no headlines about this flight, no viral videos, just a woman in old shoes, finally seen, not because of who she married, but because of how she carried herself when no one was looking. As the plane banked gently toward its final approach, the cabin grew quieter, not because of fear or turbulence, but because something unspoken had settled over the passengers, a reverence, almost, as if each of them had become aware that they were part of something more meaningful than just a flight. Seatbelt signs blinked on, trays locked, window shades lifted. Eileen remained still, hands folded, eyes soft as she gazed toward the coastline that now revealed itself like a memory resurfacing after years of silence. San Diego stretched below them, sun-kissed and familiar, but her heart wasn't racing for the reunion ahead. It was resting in the moment. This one, where she felt, perhaps for the first time in a long while, not invisible, not pitted, but seen, respected, whole. A light knock touched her shoulder. The flight attendant smiled, this time with no performance in her eyes, only warmth. "Mrs. Lane, the captain is ready for you. He said to tell you the view is especially beautiful today." Eileen rose carefully, her knees reminding her that time is no liar, and followed the attendant to the front of the cabin. As she walked, passengers parted for her without being told, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. A silent, collective understanding that she was not just someone's wife. She was someone. The cockpit door opened, and there he was, Henry, still in uniform, still composed, but with a softness reserved only for her. He turned slightly in his seat and extended his hand toward the jump seat beside him. "Come on in," he said. "Let me show you how I land a promise." Eileen chuckled as she took her seat and buckled in. "You always did love a dramatic line. And you always did keep me grounded," he replied. The co-pilot greeted her with a nod, clearly already aware of who she was, though he said nothing beyond a respectful "ma'am." She looked out through the windshield, and for a moment, everything else vanished, the judgment at the gate, the whispers in the aisle, even the years that had tried their best to wear her down. All that remained was the sky, the sea, and the quiet rhythm of trust between a man and a machine, and a woman who had loved him before either had names. As Henry guided the aircraft toward descent, he spoke gently, almost like reciting an old love letter beneath his breath. "You remember the first time I flew you over this city?" She nodded. "You were so nervous. You told me if we crashed, we'd at least go down together." "Romantic," she whispered. "Terrifying," he teased. "But you never let go of my hand." "I never needed to," she said. And they both fell into silence again, not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind. The kind built over decades of quiet resilience, of mistakes forgiven, of hands held through storms that had nothing to do with weather. The landing gear lowered. Flaps adjusted. The city grew closer, more detailed, each rooftop and tree rising to meet them like old friends. As they descended, Henry glanced sideways. "This airline, this company, I built it because I wanted to fly on my own terms. But you gave it soul. You reminded me who it was for." Eileen smiled. "Henry Lane, if you're about to get sentimental while landing a Boeing 737, I swear I'll land it smoother than anyone else in the air," he finished. "Watch me." The wheels touched down so gently that even the most seasoned passengers blinked in surprise. Applause broke out in the cabin, part for the landing, part for something else. Something they couldn't quite name, but felt in their bones. The co-pilot made the standard announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Diego. On behalf of Captain Lane and the entire crew, thank you for flying with us." But then Henry took the mic one more time. "And one more thing," he added, his voice calm, but full of pride. "Today marks the final flight I will personally pilot for this airline. After 35 years in the sky, I'll be hanging up this uniform. But before I go, I want to acknowledge the person who made it possible, for every takeoff, every return, every risk I ever took, my wife, Eileen Lane. She sat quietly for years while I chased wind and ambition. She endured absences, missed dinners, and long nights alone. She never asked for recognition. But today, I give it." Inside the cabin, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Some eyes welled. A man in row 10 removed his hat. A flight attendant in the galley wiped her cheek. Eileen closed her eyes, not to hide, but to hold the moment longer. When she opened them, Henry had turned toward her, voice low again. "You're the best flight plan I ever followed." They disembarked together, hand in hand, walking slowly through the jet bridge. There was no red carpet, no press, just sunlight pouring in through the terminal glass like a benediction. Her sister would be waiting. So would luggage. So would life. But for now, Eileen walked with shoes that once had been mocked, but now carried the weight of a story no one would forget. 2 weeks had passed since the flight, yet the story of the woman in the old shoes continued to ripple far beyond the cabin of Flight 417. It hadn't gone viral. There were no shaky cell phone videos, no hashtags, but somehow it lived on. In dinner conversations, in book clubs, in quiet nods exchanged between strangers at airport gates. People didn't know her name, but they remembered how they felt when they heard about her. They remembered how something inside them stirred at the thought that the person they'd ignored, or worse, judged, might carry a story deeper than they could imagine. Eileen didn't seek attention after the flight. She returned home, unpacked her modest bag, watered her violets, and replied to her sister's thank you card with a handwritten letter. The week after, she resumed her usual rhythm, visiting the library, helping at the community kitchen on Thursdays, and sitting at her usual bench in the park every Sunday afternoon. But something had changed, not in her, but in how the world around her responded. The librarian now greeted her with a warmth that wasn't just routine. The children at the soup kitchen no longer ran past her to the younger volunteers. Even the barista at the corner coffee shop, who'd never remembered her name before, now smiled and said, "Welcome back, Mrs. Lang." One morning, a letter arrived in a thick white envelope embossed with the airline's logo. Inside was an invitation, handwritten, not printed, inviting Eileen to speak at a leadership summit for the airline's regional managers. She laughed at the idea. "What would I say to a room full of executives?" she asked Henry over tea. He looked over the rim of his cup and said, "Exactly what you always say. Nothing flashy, just the truth." She thought about it, not because she craved the stage, but because she realized that sometimes stories need to be told, if not for recognition, then for the sake of those who never learned how to tell theirs. At the summit, she stood in a soft gray dress and her same old shoes, freshly polished, still worn. The room of executives, most in tailored suits and designer heels, sat politely at first, unsure of what to expect. She began not with a joke, not with a quote, but with a question. "Have you ever mistaken silence for insignificance?" The room shifted. Pens paused. She continued. "On that flight, some of you might have seen me. You wouldn't have remembered. I was just a woman in a tired coat and older shoes. Some thought I was lost. Some were embarrassed by me. But none of you knew I once helped build the first flight crew training manual for this very airline, or that the man flying that plane trusted my counsel more than his own instinct on the day he took his first flight as captain." She didn't speak long, but when she stepped down, there was no applause. Not because they weren't moved, but because some things deserve a silence that claps on the inside. After that, something else began to shift. Within weeks, airline policy was reviewed. Staff training included a new module, silent stories, seeing beyond appearance. Flight attendants began receiving reminders to pause, to observe, to ask questions with kindness instead of assumptions. It wasn't mandatory, but those who leaned into it found something surprising. Better passengers, smoother flights, and more thank you notes. Back home, Eileen took none of the credit. She didn't want it. She said no to the interview requests, the podcasts, the book offers. "Let someone else be famous," she told Henry. "I'm too old to chase applause." What she did say yes to, however, was something smaller, something more powerful. She started a weekly storytelling circle at the community center. She called it Flight Paths, a place where older people, especially women, could sit and tell the stories no one ever asked to hear. The ones that never made it into photo albums. The ones lived in kitchens, in laundromats, in hospital waiting rooms, in quiet courage and unseen grace. The room filled slowly at first. A retired nurse, a widowed math teacher, a seamstress who once stitched a wedding dress for a stranger during a blackout. One by one they came, and they spoke, and they listened, and the walls of that modest room swelled with the kind of wisdom you can't Google. One afternoon, as the session ended and the chairs were being stacked, a younger woman approached Eileen. She worked at the pharmacy nearby and had heard about the group from her grandmother. She looked nervous, but curious. "Can anyone come?" she asked. "Even if I don't have a story?" Eileen smiled and handed her a chair to unfold. "If you've ever listened to someone and let them feel real," she said, "you already have one." Years later, when Henry passed, the airline sent flowers. Dozens. They offered a tribute flight, a memorial plaque, even to rename a lounge after him. Eileen politely declined most of it, but she allowed one thing: a brass plaque mounted on the crew room wall at the airline's training center. It didn't mention rank or ownership. It read only, "For the man who knew how to fly, and the woman who taught him how to land." When Eileen herself passed quietly in her sleep at the age of 89, her shoes were placed at the foot of the casket. Not because they were beautiful, but because they had walked through a world that often looked away and kept walking anyway. And at her memorial, not one person mentioned wealth or fame or success. They spoke of her smile, her stillness, her steady gaze that made you feel like the center of the room. They spoke of the stories she drew out of others, not by asking for them, but by giving people space to remember who they were before the world told them who to be. And long after the guests left, one young woman remained, seated by the flowers, writing something in a small notebook. She wasn't family. She had met Eileen only once at a storytelling night, but she had never forgotten. She closed the notebook, wiped a tear, and whispered, "Maybe one day someone will look at me and not see my shoes, but my story."